After e4, c5, and f4, this is the Mcdonnell, and black has to play d5. So there's two main variations I'm going to go through. Pawn takes, and then pawn goes up. So pawn goes up to e5. I'm going to start it like that, and then next video I'll do pawn takes. So knight c6 is the next move. This is a particularly annoying opening I've encountered many times, and especially in blitz, it used to be quite a problem for me to face it. So now there's plenty of options: knight f3, bishop developing, or even d3 sometimes. Little by little, we will cover all of them. In this video, I'm going to focus on the idea of c3-d4, which is the idea of creating this massive pawn chain. And the whole point of playing e5 was also because white loves to support the e5 pawn with another pawn and creates a center like that. So after c3, here's a crucial move: h5. White's attacking from White's pushing pawn from the queen side, we're pushing from the king side. The idea is that often, if you play this kind of move like e6, this bishop is kind of blocked, it's useless. At the same time, you cannot play knight f6 to support your bishop in g4 because there's a pawn in e5. So you play h5, and you're willing to put the bishop in g4. So after the move d4, right, which is fairly logical, we take, and then pawn takes back. And now white has achieved what he wanted, which is this, building this center, the usual f4, e5, d4 pawn. Many of you who are Sicilian players will have encountered this move a lot. This is also very similar to the Grand Prix, which we will talk about in the future. So now black continues with knight h6. As you all know, the knight wants to go to f5 and start applying pressure on d4. So this c3 move and d4 game, when they play the Mcdonnell against your Sicilian, will have to be met with knight h6, knight f5, because after the c pawn goes to c3, you take, then there is no more support to this pawn. There is no more pawn defending that pawn. That means the knight f5, knight c6, queen b6, all of these moves potentially will go and target a pawn that cannot be defended by another pawn. So after knight f3, logical move, developing knight, protecting the pawn, allowing the white player to castle as soon as the bishop is moved. Black continues with bishop g4, crucial move. You're pinning the knight, and the idea is to take the knight and win a free pawn, free central pawn that also produces a passed pawn, this d5 pawn. So let's go through some options now. We're going to go through bishop e2, and then bishop e3 and bishop b5. Let's not forget we're willing to take the knight, and pawn taking back will be terrible. So if the queen takes back, we win a pawn. So let's say, for example, bishop e2. This unpins the knight, and now black has to play knight f5 to put more and more pressure on the pawn. And the funny thing is that white can't defend it with the bishop because you can just take it, and the knight isn't really defending anything, and so now white castles. Pointless to say that h3 or h3 is a waste of time, because if h3 is played, you're just gonna do the same thing, right? You're just gonna take, and so white should just go on with development, and if he doesn't, then you just take the knight. After castling, we take the knight, and now either bishop takes or rook takes. Let's say bishop takes. We have won a pawn. We take with this knight. And another thing I forgot to say is that h5 is also crucial, because in this type of setup of white, the idea is also they have of playing g4, so that also stops that plan. So the knight in f5 is sitting very comfortably. So now black is up a pawn, and we'll go on with moves like e6, bishop c5. Bishop c5 is excellent in this diagonal. Will force the king to move to h1. And yeah, black's got a good advantage already. We have a passed pawn. A move like queen a4 is not a threat at all, because we're just going to play b5. And now the queen will have to move again, and that will come with the black player gaining tempos. Also, the black player is threatening the square c2, so the queen can't take the knight because of the other knight, and she will have to go all the way back to d1 in order to safeguard c2. And so what's the reason why black has got such a great advantage at the moment? Is because the white player can't really develop the bishop to e3 to any meaningful square, and black's literally got no weaknesses. This knight just cannot be removed. So to make an example, before the queen went to a4, instead of queen a4, the white player can try to develop the bishop from the fianchetto. But either way, after b3 and e6, bishop b2 is met by bishop c5. This is the best square for the knight to be. Now the knight is threatening to win everything, right? It's just a free bishop. So the king will have to move in order to avoid the disaster. But after king moves, if needless to say, if bishop takes, then bishop takes. This comes with a fork. You're going to be winning a lot of material. If king moves, queen h4 wins the game on the spot, because how are you going to stop this checkmate? Because you have so many nasty threats. You've got knight g3 check. The pawn can't move. The king will have to move, and then you've got a checkmate. So you're threatening check. Pawn can't take, so king moves, and then knight takes f3 is checkmate. So best move by white now is queen e1, which puts more protection over the square g3. But now we're going to take the bishop, and well, rook cannot take because otherwise we take the queen and it follows with mate. And after pawn takes, we play queen h3 with the threat of knight g3. What's the difference now? The difference is that now we're attacking the rook. So after knight g3, queen cannot take because of queen takes rook. So white's best move is knight d2, which protects the rook and connects the rook as well as soon as the queen moves. Black now continues with h4, and now it's game over. The threat of knight g3 is inevitable. Knight g3 can be played now because there's a pawn supporting it. So queen takes g3 doesn't work because you can take the queen. So let's make a recap. After f4 d5, now e5, we play knight c6, and the move like c3 is met by h5, d4, and we take the pawn. Take, classical Sicilian swap of the center. Knight h6. It's pointless to mention how this pawn is not free, because now we can play bishop g4, attacking the queen. The queen will have to move. Wherever she goes, she will lose the central pawn. And it comes with the threat of the knight here, and we're achieving the same thing as before. We're winning a pawn that is just too strong, too important. So here we are again, the queen cannot take the pawn. And so a normal move like knight f3 is met by bishop g4, you know why. And now we're just going to go through two more variations for this video. We're going to go through bishop b5 and bishop e3. Bishop e3 could be an idea because it stops it protects the pawn in d4, and after knight f5 the bishop can go back. So let's deal with this. Knight f5 immediately attacking the bishop will have to move, and the bishop was protecting the pawn, so there would be no point in white losing that bishop, because then we will have double pressure on this d4 square. Now black continues with e6. And needless to say, if white plays h3, we don't have any problem swapping bishop for the knight. Then white will have to take with the pawn in order to keep this pawn alive. So for example, if he takes with the queen, then we can just take this. Again, we've won a pawn, a central pawn, and we produced a passed pawn, and we've got this excellent position. If pawn takes, then we just play queen b6, and we have concluded the attack on the d4 pawn, and we're going to win it no matter what. So here again, what happens after bishop e5, pinning our knight? Now we play queen check, and obviously the only move in this situation is knight c3, because it protects the king from the check and also defends the bishop. Now we play bishop b4. The idea obviously is to take the knight and then win the bishop for free. So white is now forced to make the only move that makes sense, which is to take the knight, not only to avoid, to release the pressure, but also because the bishop went to b5 for the very reason of removing one of the attackers of d4. So bishop takes, only move, pawn takes back. And now we're threatening to take this knight and the pawn as well, and to put white's king in a terrible position like e2, unless he doesn't want to lose the rook, because queen d2 will lose the rook. Knight d2 will not be possible because bishop will take queen. So we have double attack on c3, and white has to deal with that. So what happens after queen d3? We simply play c5. The position is completely crashing here, and the idea now is to take the knight. Bishop takes, and after queen takes, then we will be able to take this pawn for free. And if the pawn takes, then so for example, after pawn takes, we're still going to take, and now we're going to play rook to c8, and we have completed the attack on the knight. We have just too many attackers. We're going to be winning material. White can try to defend After castling, black's position is -7, and white's structure is terrible. Queens are still on the board, and white king is never going to be safe. So we need to go back because we just played c5 and have played black's move next. But that was in order to show what the plan was. It's white to move now, and white can see all of this, and he's going to a losing endgame. So he can do the best move, which is pawn takes e5. Now, still, we take the knight, and after queen takes back, we play rook to c8. So as you can see, the plan is pretty much the same, since that's the type of setup we have, and that's the type of weaknesses we're going to hit. So now, what happens after castling? It looks like in this endgame, the white player has been able to somehow survive, but the position is just better for black. Now we're going to take back this pawn. Let's just go on a few more moves to finish this endgame, and then we'll go on to the next variation. Black has now achieved what he wanted, which is basically this passed pawn, and that is it's a strength for us. The white player is therefore not interested in swaps, and if he does swap, that just simplifies everything for black. So this is what happens after white playing the best moves of this variation, c3-d4. The advantage is about almost -3, something like that. Yeah, so white definitely shouldn't swap anything. If white swaps, then we can take the check. Queen blocking, for example, will be met by queen b4. The idea of black is the castle, so if the queen were to go for this pawn, we could even just castle and eventually take that pawn. The main idea of the black player though remains, and the whole strength of the black player remains the d5 pawn, which is a passed pawn, and after castling and supporting the pawn with the rooks, you should play accurately and exploit that in your favor. Let's just look at a few moves here, which is basically the best moves. The best move by white is knight to e2, and white continues with h4. The idea of the black player is to play bishop b6, castle the king, and then infiltrate the rooks with the second rank. We are favorable to swap, so if the rook will come to c1, we can take it. Rook takes, and we take in a3. It's a free pawn in future scenario. This will force the white player to play moves like a3, b4, but those are pretty slow anyway, even though they're the best. So let's just make a few examples. After h3, stopping the pawn, bishop b6, white plays a3. The idea to play b4 and no longer worry about these two pawns. Black castles, and after rook a to c1. Again, this is just an endgame of the many possible endgames that could happen. So it's not like we're gonna memorize this specific variation, but rather the concept and the patterns and the weaknesses. As I said already, this pawn is our most important thing. So after the swap, we also know that we are happy to swap. So rook takes, rook takes. It looks like we've given an open file to our opponent, but now we play queen to d2, improving the position of the queen and start attacking pawns. Now black has a very simple threat, which is knight to g3 in this specific situation. Or when they play h3, always look at this outpost. Knight to g3, the queen wants to take the rook for free, but the knight is defending it. So if knight takes, we can take the rook. Otherwise, we have double attack on this knight. So best move by white is to take, and after pawn takes, we're going to play knight g3 eventually. So let's say b4 to protect the pawn is met by knight g3. Double attack on the knight, we're going to win the rook or the knight. If the rook goes to c7, for example, getting away from all of that trouble, then we will simply pick up this pawn and carry on. So let's do a quick recap. f4 and d5, pawn pushes, and then knight c6. And this c3-d4 idea is met by h5. So when the pawn d4 goes, you take, and now knight h6. We said that the queen can't take here. So after knight f3, bishop g4. And now we're going to go through the last option, which is bishop b5, which is pinning the knight already, and trying to give the white players some peace. Now we still play knight f5, so same thing. So after castling, black continues with queen b6. If instead of castling though, if white plays h3, for example, exploiting the fact that the knight is pinned, then again the plan is the same. Bishop takes, queen takes, and now queen b6. The reason is that we don't usually want to move this knight to take the pawn in d4, but rather this one, the one in c. So queen b6 now should do the job. And now we're attacking the bishop, so bishop takes, pawn takes, so that we can keep the pressure on this square. And now there's two options, bishop e3 or g4. Bishop e3 is met by queen b2, winning the game for obvious reason. g4 is another idea, since there's a pawn in h3 supporting the g4 pawn, trying to remove this knight from f5. Then we simply take this pawn, and after queen f2 pinning the knight, we take the pawn. And now we just so much better. The pawn can't take back because of the rook, and a move like bishop e3 is met by knight c2. If queen takes, we can take the bishop with check, simplify the game. If they don't, well, we have double attack here, and we're still very happy to simplify. So in this position, after bishop b5, we said castling. We're gonna go on like that, and queen b6. So now bishop takes. We're gonna go through bishop takes. What happens after knight c3 now? Looks like the game is becoming more and more normal. We're gonna play e6. So now black has a simple idea. After defending this pawn, we just want to take the pawn d4, and it cannot be defended because the only way to defend would be bishop e3, but we can take it. So white's best move is to take the knight in order to remove one of the defenders. After takes, we take back with the queen, and we have a plan of going on with h4, mainly because we don't want to create a minority against the majority here. So we go 1 against 2. Also, we're going to play h4 now, and when we have future plans of playing knight d4 and bishop c5, we don't want to have a queen in b5 and b6 where we can be attacked and be deprived of our dark square bishop, which against the Mcdonnell and against the Grand Prix is just glorious. So after queen c6, best move by white is knight to e2 to put more defense over the square in d4, because we also have the plan of taking, and then if queen takes, bishop c5 pins the queen to the king. We've all must have seen this before. So now h4 is our move. How do we respond to h3? In this case, we don't take, because it's pointless. White has two defenders here. If we take, rook takes, and we're not really winning this pawn. So bishop h5 is the move now. Yeah, best move by white now is queen to d3. White can't really do many moves. We're going to continue the game here. We're winning. Got an advantage of about one piece according to engine evaluation. We're going to play bishop e7 now. Let's just quickly mention that the white player is paralyzed. This pawn will be taken en passant, or either will be taken g3. Black is constantly applying pressure on d4, which will be able to be taken later. And the most boring variation will be something like bishop to d2, going for rook to c1 and just play the most normal developing moves, but we castle. If the rook to c1, we play queen to b6, putting pressure on b3, and still putting pressure on this square. Black goes on to win the endgame because of the bishop pair. And let's see the most boring variation, even like bishop to c3, protecting everything. Black has a plan of playing a5, a4. Also, bishop to g6 is a very good move, threatening to win the exchange from g3, forcing the queen to move again. So let's just mention what the plan is. We're going to play a5 and then bishop g6. White's plan now recommended is knight to g5. Of course, we're not going to give up the bishop pair because then white takes back. We're isolating the pawn, but we're also opening the rook. It doesn't look any good. We're going to play bishop to g6, attacking the queen. And after a move like queen to d2, we have queen a6, allowing b5, b4. So we're getting space on the queen side. And we're just going to enjoy a game where we have so much more freedom than our opponent. We've got the knight jumping to a lot of potential squares, some of them not immediately. You gotta look at the opponent. You can't move the knight anywhere. Queen's a bit stuck. He's got an ugly bishop, whereas we have both of them. We can drop this line here as black has an advantage evaluate about piece. So here we are, the same position as before. We're going through the variation bishop b5 immediately. We play knight f5, and then white castles, and black plays queen to b6. So earlier we went through knight c3. What happens after bishop takes immediately? Now we take with this pawn, and we keep applying pressure over these two squares. Knight c3 now is some sort of transposition, or at least it looks like a transposition, but it's now too late for white because we're going to go for bishop f3. And now there's two ways to take back, queen or rook. If queen takes back, we play queen takes pawn, comes with check, that's a free pawn, king moves, and now ace e6. And so what does white do now? Black's position is so much better. We have this passed pawn which is supported by another pawn as well, and we have a plan of playing h4, knight g3. It's a tremendous threat. So a move like rook to d1, immediately trying to kick out the queen away from there, is met simply by queen to b6, staying on this incredible diagonal. Bishop cannot develop to e3 because we have two attackers, and a bishop developing or any other move, let's say b3 as well, that's a possibility for the bishop to go in fianchetto. Either way, we're going to play h4, attacking knight g3, winning the game. So knight g3 wins the game. If pawn takes back, that's a check with the rook, and there's a queen protecting g1. So white has to stop that. A move like h3 simply paralyzes everything. White black will play rook c8 with the plan of playing c5-d4 and keep pushing the passed pawn. Move like knight e2, which is the best move according to the engine, because it puts more protection over the square g3, is met by bishop to e7. And yeah, black enjoys this position. It's the plan is the same. d5 is going to be our greatest strength. The future plan is something like g6. We don't worry about like white's move like bishop d2 or bishop b2 or d2. We're going to play king f8 and find our safety in g7 because we don't want a castle, of course, since we have this very strong rook. And we enjoy a position where an opponent cannot move, basically, because knight d4 will just get taken. I mean, white can play bishop to b2 and give more support over the square d4, but then we can also play c5 and put more protection over d4. So in this position, last thing we're going to look at after bishop takes, we went through queen takes. What happens after rook takes? Still, we take the pawn. Now two options: bishop blocks or queen takes. Let's say queen takes. We take back with attacking the rook. The rook will have to move. Rook to d3 is the most active move. It comes with an attack on the knight. We play knight to c2. So look out for these forks. So for example, if the rook had gone somewhere else, then this would be a fork. Rook d3. This rook doesn't get attacked. This rook will get attacked. So rook b1. Now black continues with e6. We still have this d5 strength. Best move by white is knight to e4. We continue with rook b8. And now that the knight has been removed from a4, the white player goes through making a fork, which is the best move for white, attacking the knight and the pawn. Black goes on with knight d4, protecting the pawn. Bishop e3 cannot be played to attack the knight because of knight e2. And a move like king f2 is met by bishop to b4, attacking the rook. The rook will not be able to stay on the c file anymore because it's attacking everywhere else. And after moving, we're finally able to push c5 and eventually remove the knight and continue with the passed pawn. The very last thing after queen takes, we have to look at bishop e3. Now we swap quiz. Queen takes, rook takes, knight takes, rook takes. So it's all a swap, and we go rook to b8. Again, we're working on this pawn supported. Now, how can white stop us from taking this pawn? Either b3 or knight a4. Knight a4 is met by rook to b4, which attacks two of them. So b3 is then met by rook takes pawn, whereas b3 immediately is met by e6 and the threat of bishop c5, winning the game. So knight a4 now, improving the position of the knight and attacking c5. Black continues with king to d7. We're not going to castle in this game. The king is safe behind this chain of pawns. A move like rook to c3, which is the whole point. He wants to play knight c5 and protect the knight. And black continues with rook to b5, putting more and more protection over c5. The idea of potentially pushing and go on with the pawn, the d pawn. White continues with rook to c1. It's got double attack over c6. And black plays bishop to a3. White can't really go for this pawn because we'll take the exchange. So white rook stays on the same file and keeps applying pressure. And now we play rook to c8. So we really have to protect this pawn no matter what. We will go on to a winning endgame by playing c5-d4 basically later on. A move like rook h3, needless to mention that it's met by g6, protecting this is a completely safe pawn chain. And after knight c3 attacking the rook, we play rook c5, and we're going to stop the line here since it will be impossible to go on for the next millions of potential variations. But yeah, that's the setup you're going to be using to defeat the Mcdonnell.